Let's talk about the concept of value when you're a kid. Back in the early 2000s, buying a new game was an event. You saved up your pocket money, walked into a shop, and handed over a full retail price, expecting an experience that would last you for weeks, or at least a solid, challenging weekend. So imagine the scene: I bring home a brand new Resident Evil game, unbox the light gun, plug the tangle of cables into the PlayStation 2, and settle in on the carpet for what I assume is going to be another deep survival horror nightmare. The game boots up, I'm running around a hijacked cruise ship, popping zombies in first person, and to my genuine surprise, I'm actually having a really good time. It feels significantly better than the rushed arcade jank of Survivor 2. The shooting is snappy, the environments look decent, and I'm completely in the zone. And then the screen fades to black, the music swells, and the credits start rolling. I remember just sitting there, staring blankly at the endgame results screen. The clear time was hovering around an hour. An hour? I hadn't even had my tea yet. It was one of the most baffling gaming experiences of my childhood. I had just paid full price for a game that I had managed to start and finish in a single short sitting before the afternoon was even over. There was no anger, exactly, just utter confusion. It was fine. I genuinely enjoyed the 60 minutes I spent with it, but because it was so shockingly brief and frictionless, it left absolutely zero footprint in my memory. I put the disc back in the case, put it on the shelf, and literally never felt the desire to play it again until I started this retrospective project over 20 years later. Resident Evil Dead Aim is the ultimate weekend rental. It sits in this bizarre transition period of the franchise where the main games were delivering massive sprawling masterpieces, and the spin-offs felt like they were just trying to keep the brand's logo in the magazines. It was a perfectly functional hour of entertainment, but it was the clearest sign yet that Capcom was just holding our attention, keeping us busy with an expensive appetizer while we all waited for the main course.
Choose to use such ugly guns is still a mystery to me.
Morpheus.
One of the funniest things about Dead Aim is the sheer confusion it causes before I even put the disc in the tray. If you were a kid following the import sections of gaming magazines back then, you probably noticed that in Japan, the game was officially branded as Gun Survivor 4. I had played the original Survivor on the PS1, and I had suffered through the recycled arcade mess of Survivor 2 on the PlayStation 2, so naturally, my brain was stuck on a very obvious question: where on earth was Survivor 3? Did I completely black out a Resident Evil release? It turns out I hadn't missed the zombie game at all. Capcom had decided that the first entry in the Gun Survivor series was going to be a Dino Crisis spin-off called Dino Stalker. There was almost no marketing that connected the two franchises in the West, or at least whatever marketing there was completely passed by me. I had absolutely no idea it was part of the same mechanical lineage. Looking back, that specific blind spot perfectly captures my relationship with Capcom's side projects during this era. The news just wasn't grabbing me the same way anymore. When Code Veronica, the remake, and Zero were announced, they were massive industry-stopping events. You pored over every blaring screenshot in the magazines and talked about them in the playground, but after the 1-2 punch of Survivor 2 being a lazy cash grab and Garden being an 8-bit oddity, my radar for the spin-offs was basically switched off. Dead Aim fell squarely into this weird bridge of the time. It was an era where the franchise felt like it was fracturing. The mainline games were pushing the absolute limits of the hardware, but the secondary titles were just these bizarre, disposable experiments. We were hitting a wall of spin-off fatigue. Even though I didn't know exactly what Resident Evil 4 was going to look like yet, there was a collective feeling that the classic era had run its course. Dead Aim wasn't a bad game, but it was undeniably a holding pattern. It was a piece of filler designed to keep the audience occupied and the logo on the shelves while Capcom figured out how to reinvent the wheel. If there was one thing Dead Aim actually deserves credit for, it's the gameplay loop. Up until this point, the Gun Survivor series had been a bit of a mechanical joke. Capcom had been trying to force a slow, methodical horror franchise into a clunky, full first-person perspective that just never felt right on a standard TV screen. Dead Aim finally found the compromise. It introduced a bizarre Frankenstein hybrid system that actually worked. When you're just exploring the Spencer Rain, the camera sits behind your character in a fairly traditional third-person view. You get to see your protagonist jogging around the hallways, checking doors, and picking up green herbs. It felt like a proper modern action-adventure game. But the second you hit the aim button, the camera instantly snapped into a first-person perspective right down the barrel of your weapon. Because I brought this home with a light gun, specifically the G-Con 2, this transition was a massive novelty. You navigate the ship using the little D-pad built into the gun, and when a zombie stumbles out of a cabin, you'd physically raise the plastic barrel to the screen, snap into first person, and just start blasting. It was a brilliant trick that completely fixed the motion sickness and the navigational headaches of the earlier survival titles. You could actually see where you were going, but you still got that arcade-style satisfaction of popping off headshots. It's widely considered the best of the light gun spin-offs for exactly this reason. It completely lacked the suffocating tension of the fixed camera angles we'd just survived in the remake in Zero, but it made up for it by just being undeniably fun to shoot. Looking back, you can almost see the gears turning in the Capcom development rooms. They were clearly experimenting with the relationship between the camera and the crosshair. Dead Aim feels like this awkward, forgotten middle step between the classic tank controls of the PS1 era and the revolutionary aiming system that would define Resident Evil 4 just a couple of years later. It was a clunky experiment, but for the 60 minutes it lasted, it was one that actually justified its own existence. Let's talk about our leading man, Bruce McGivern. If you ever wanted to know what Leon S. Kennedy would look like if you ordered him from a discount catalogue, Bruce is your guy. He's got the floppy hair, the cocky attitude, and the government agent backstory, but he lands with all the charisma of a wet piece of cardboard. He works for the US Stratcom, which sounds incredibly official, but his entire personality just boils down to being a generic action hero who occasionally spits out terrible one-liners. He's perfectly fine for a game that lasts an hour, but he is completely disposable. You aren't emotionally invested in his survival, you just need him to hold the gun. Then there's the setting. After the high-speed claustrophobia of the Ecliptic Express in Resident Evil Zero, Capcom decided to keep the transport theme going and threw us onto the Spencer Rain, a hijacked Umbrella luxury cruise liner. As a location, it's actually a brilliant setup. You have sweeping ground staircases, narrow crew quarters, and luxury dining rooms that have been completely trashed by a viral outbreak. But because of the hybrid gameplay and the sheer speed at which you tear through the campaign, the ship never actually gets the chance to become a character. When you were exploring the Spencer Mansion, every single hallway felt heavy. You memorised the floorboards and the blind corners because you were trapped there for a dozen hours. The Spencer Rain, on the other hand, just feels like a very pretty shooting gallery. There is no suffocating atmosphere here. You aren't dreading what's behind the next cabin door just because you know you could snap your light gun up and blast whatever comes through in 3 seconds flat. It turns a luxury cruise liner into an arcade-themed park ride. You move from room to room, clear the targets, grab the shiny key item, and sprint to the next deck. It's undeniably fun, but it completely lacks the psychological weight that made the mainline game so iconic. The Spencer Rain is just a disposable background for Bruce to shoot his way through, which perfectly matches the energy of the entire spin-off.
Think that cheap cologne you're wearing is going to your head. What do you plan to do with the T-virus?
I'm afraid that's all the playtime we have for today. You die. Now.
So let's talk about the absolute peak of spin-off absurdity, The villain, Morpheus D. Duvall. Up to this point, Resident Evil villains were usually cold corporate executives or mad scientists hiding in underground labs. Morpheus is a disgruntled Umbrella employee, sure, but his entire personality revolves around a bizarre, narcissistic obsession with beauty and elegance. He's the kind of guy who hijacks a luxury cruise liner and threatens the global superpowers with missiles, but makes sure his hair is perfectly swept back while he does it. But where things go completely off the rails is the inevitable boss fight mutation. Desperate and wounded, he injects himself with the T and G virus, a literal cocktail of the franchise's two most famous bioweapons. If you remember William Birkin from Resident Evil 2, the G virus usually turns you into a massive, asymmetric mound of rotten flesh and eyeballs. Morpheus, on the other hand, mutates into a graceful, female-presenting tyrant. I'm not joking, he transforms into a sleek, glowing bioweapon wearing organic silhouettes. He gracefully leaps around the area, tossing out electric attacks and dodging bullets like a comic book supervillain. It is pure, unapologetic camp. As a kid sitting on the floor with a plastic light gun, I was just along for the ride. It's highly entertaining, and blasting an electric super mutant in the face with a shotgun is good arcade fun, but looking back now, Morpheus is the perfect symbol of how far these spin-offs had drifted from the actual identity of the mainline series. We had just come off the 2002 remake, where the horror was grounded in the tragic gothic misery of Lisa Trevor and the terrifying panic of a Crimson Head waking up in a dark hallway. And then, less than a year later, we're on a boat fighting an electric supermodel tyrant in high heels. It was a massive tonal whiplash. It proved that Capcom was just throwing whatever they could at the wall in these sad games, completely abandoning the suffocating dread of the classic era for B-movie absurdity. It's hilarious, but it definitely isn't survival horror.
Why did you save me? Your first priority should have been to disarm the missiles.
A Donghua never abandons a woman.
By the time Dead Aim hit shelves in 2003, the landscape of survival horror was in a very strange place. If you look back at the timeline we've been mapping out, Capcom was essentially operating two completely different versions of the franchise simultaneously. On one side, you had the absolute titans, Code Veronica, the remake and Zero. These were massive, industry-defining heavyweights that pushed the hardware to its absolute breaking point and perfected the traditional formula. On the other side, you had the B-team projects. We'd already suffered through the recycled arcade port of Survivor 2 and squinted our way through the 8-bit, non-canon Mesa Garden. Dead Aim was undeniably the best of this secondary pile, but it still felt like blatant filler. It was the absolute peak of the spin-off fatigue. There was a time when seeing a Resident Evil blood-spattered font on a game case guaranteed a premium, terrifying experience. But by this point, that prestige was flaking off. You could feel that Capcom was just treading water, using these lower-budget experiments to keep the brand visible on store shelves while the main development team figured out what on earth to do next. The gaming industry was moving incredibly fast around them. The PlayStation 2 era was in full swing, dual analog sticks had become the standard, and players were getting used to faster, more dynamic action. The hybrid control scheme of Dead Aim was a clever band-aid, but it highlighted a much bigger problem. The classic 90s mechanics were on life support. We didn't know exactly what Shinji Mikami was cooking up for Resident Evil 4 yet, but there was an unspoken understanding amongst the fanbase that the series needed a massive kick in the teeth. Dead Aim was a fun distraction for a single afternoon, but ultimately, it was the waiting room. It was the game you rented to kill some time, sitting around waiting for the franchise to finally wake up and revolutionise the genre all over again. So here we are, over 20 years later, putting the Spencer reign behind us for what is more than likely the final time. Resident Evil Dead Aim is the absolute definition of a one-and-done experience. It's not an offensively broken cash grab like Survivor 2, and it's not a bizarre, non-canon 8-bit anomaly like Garden. It's just fine. It's a perfectly functional 60-minute shooting gallery that you play on a Saturday afternoon, think, well, that was alright, and then immediately put back on the shelf to gather dust for the rest of your childhood. And that's exactly what it did. It sat on my shelf for 2 decades. It served its purpose back in the day, giving me an excuse to plug the light gun in and blast an electric tyrant wearing stilettos. But in the grand scheme of the franchise's 30-year history, it's a little more than a footnote. It was the final gasp of the gun survivor experiment before Capcom finally accepted that the plastic peripherals and slow burn survival horror were never going to be a perfect marriage. We can officially close the book on Bruce McGivern and his disposable ocean liner, but as we finally step out of this era of spin-off fatigue, we still aren't quite ready for the massive revolution of Resident Evil 4. Capcom had one more incredibly ambitious, highly experimental trick up their sleeve for the PlayStation 2. Instead of shrinking the world down to a 1-hour arcade shooter, they decided to blow the doors completely open and tackle the one thing this series had never even attempted: online multiplayer. Next time, we're heading back into the doomed burned streets of Raccoon City, but we aren't playing as Elite Stars members, heavily armed cops or government agents. We're looking at Resident Evil Outbreak. It was a game arguably a full decade ahead of its time, asking us to bolt a chunky network adapter onto the back of our consoles and try to survive the apocalypse alongside a group of completely random strangers. The load times are going to be brutal, voice chat doesn't exist, and the infection gauge is constantly ticking. If you're enjoying the series so far, be sure to subscribe and follow along. I'll see you on the next one.
Resident Evil returns to the PlayStation 2 with innovative Resident Evil gameplay, multiplayer scenarios, and next-level design for a totally new gameplay experience.
I'm afraid that's all the playtime we have.